The morning I walked into my wedding, I thought it was going to be the happiest day of my life, until I saw the looks on their faces. The sunlight outside glowed like a blessing, its rays spilling through the stained glass windows of the church, painting the aisle in colours so soft it looked like a dream stitched together for me alone. My dress whispered around my ankles as I took slow, careful steps toward the altar, the scent of roses and lilies wrapping around me like the memory of every childhood fantasy I had ever dared to hold. This was supposed to be my day, the moment where joy replaced every loss, where I stepped into a life I had built with love, trust, and hope. The guests turned as I walked in, and for the first few moments I was wrapped in happiness. I saw my groom standing tall, his eyes soft with pride, his smile steady even though his hands trembled slightly as he waited for me. My heart swelled at the sight of him. I thought of every childhood day I had pressed flowers between diary pages, dreaming of the man who would one day stand waiting for me at the end of an aisle. I thought of how Grandma used to tuck me in at night and whisper, "One day you'll walk into your forever, and when you do, make sure the world sees your light." But then, almost as quickly as the light had filled me, it shifted. The looks began. Whispers slid like knives through the church, sharp enough for me to feel their edge even from across the aisle. My aunts leaned closer together, their heads bent, mouths curling in words they didn't intend for me to hear. Cousins tilted their chins, eyes glinting with something colder than celebration. I felt the temperature in the room drop, though the sunlight still warmed the stained glass. At first, I told myself it was nerves, mine or theirs. Weddings made people sentimental. Sometimes tears came with frowns, but the more I walked, the more I saw it clearly. Not everyone was here to celebrate me. Some were here to see me falter. I clutched my bouquet tighter, my knuckles whitening around the stems. I looked to the pastor who stood tall and dignified at the altar. His gaze was steady, kind, but even his face carried a shadow I couldn't name. My heart sank deeper. When I finally reached my groom, he reached for my hand, grounding me. His touch was warm, his thumb the vows. The church, once sacred and safe, suddenly felt like a stage where I had been pushed into the spotlight. Not as a bride, but as a target. I glanced back. Claire sat near the front, her posture perfect, her lips curved in the faintest smile. My older sister, always polished, always admired, watching me unravel, without lifting a finger. It was then I realized. This wasn't accidental, this was deliberate. The pastor's voice faltered slightly as the tension in the room grew. My groom tightened his hold on me, whispering again, "Ignore them, look at me." But even his voice couldn't drown out the sting of betrayal. I had grown up in this family, dreaming of this day, believing that blood tied us together in celebration. Instead, it tied me to an audience eager to watch me stumble. The injustice burned hot in my chest. Why couldn't they just let me have this one moment? Why couldn't they let me walk into love without dragging shadows behind me? The pastor cleared his throat and continued, but before he could reach the vows, one of my uncles stood abruptly. His voice carried through the silence. "Before this farce continues, don't you think she should explain herself?" Gasps rippled through the church. My stomach dropped, my breath caught. He went on, his words heavy with accusation I hadn't prepared for. "She knows what she's hiding. She knows what she's done. Do you all really want to bless a union built on lies?" It felt like the floor tilted under me. My knees weakened, my grip on the bouquet slipping until petals fell silently to the ground. The humiliation was complete, their eyes piercing me, their whispers replaced by outright condemnation. My heart thundered in my chest as my lips parted, but no words came. Fear tangled with anger, choking me into silence. I could feel my groom's hand on mine, steady but strained, as though he too felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on us. The pastor raised his hands for silence, his voice firm but calm. "This is neither the time nor the place," he said. But the room was already fractured, the whispers resuming, sharper now, hungrier for spectacle. I wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, to demand why they were tearing apart the one they meant to bring me peace. Instead, I stood frozen, humiliated, my joy turned into ashes before my eyes. And then, just as I thought
Rose, holding that sealed envelope, time seemed to freeze. My breath caught. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might crack my ribs. Every eye in the church was locked on me, waiting for the collapse, waiting for me to confirm the whispers that had been circling like vultures since the moment I walked down the aisle. But the weight of that envelope didn't begin here. It had begun years ago, long before vows and flowers and lace. The truth was, my wedding wasn't the first battlefield with my family. It was simply the most public. The real war had been brewing quietly, hidden behind dinner table smiles and forced holiday hugs. I grew up in a family that lived on appearances. My grandmother was the glue, the one who believed love mattered more than power. But after she passed, the cracks widened. My mother's sisters began competing over every small thing. Who had the better home? Who drove the better car? Whose children looked more polished in photographs? And though I was often the quiet one, the one who didn't fight for the spotlight, their resentment clung to me like smoke. The first sign came when my fiancé proposed. I still remember the night I called my relatives, trembling with joy, expecting squeals of happiness and blessings. Instead, there was silence on the line, followed by a clipped, "Oh, congratulations." Their voices carried the stiffness of obligation, not warmth. Later, I overheard Claire, my older sister, whispering to one of our cousins that I wasn't ready for marriage, that I was rushing, that I was trying to outshine her. Jealousy has a way of planting itself quietly, rooting deep until it blooms into poison. Claire had always been the star, the one people admired. She had the career, the wardrobe, the perfect Instagram feed. I had been the shadow, the girl who stayed close to grandma, who worked quietly, who found joy in smaller things. But the moment my fiancé slipped a ring onto my finger, suddenly I was no longer in the background. For the first time, eyes were on me, and my family didn't like it. Inheritance made things worse. My grandmother's passing left behind a house, one that weren't random. They were born from years of resentment, jealousy, and anger that I had dared to stand in the light. The betrayal sank deeper because it came from those I once trusted. These were the people who sat at birthday tables with me, who handed me gifts at Christmas, who smiled at photographs beside me. And now they were the ones who wanted to humiliate me at the moment meant to crown my happiness. My groom's hand tightened on mine, his knuckles white. He leaned toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "They don't matter," he said firmly. "You matter." His voice trembled at the edges, though, betraying his own unease. He was raised in a family that celebrated joy, not one that sought to sabotage it. Seeing my blood turn into wolves unsettled him in ways he didn't know how to name. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to close my ears to the whispers, to drown in the warmth of his love. But the injustice was too sharp. How could they do this here in a church before God and family and friends? How could they try to ruin the one day meant to be sacred? The pastor tried to steady the ceremony, his words faltering but steadying again, guiding us toward vows. But then my uncle's voice rang out, slicing through the stillness like a blade. Shouldn't she explain herself before we blessed this marriage? Gasps rippled through the pews, my breath freezing in my chest. My uncle, who had once carried me on his shoulders as a child, now stood in front of everyone, his voice carrying accusation. His eyes, once warm, were now hard, filled with disdain. He wasn't alone. Murmurs of agreement followed, whispers turning into bold statements. A cousin muttered about lies. An aunt crossed her arms, her face twisted in disgust. Even Claire, seated near the front, leaned back with her arms crossed, her smirk unbothered, as though she had orchestrated this moment and was enjoying the spectacle. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the floorboards. My groom glanced around, his jaw tight, fury building in his eyes. He wanted to defend me, I could see it, but he also knew this was my battle. He squeezed my hand again.
Envelope. Its edges were worn, the seal old but intact, as though it had been preserved for years. A ripple went through the pews. Confusion, curiosity, suspicion. Claire's face stiffened for the first time. the smirk faltering as her eyes locked on the paper in his hand. "This," the pastor said, his voice steady, "was entrusted to me long ago. I was told it should only be read if truth itself was being questioned." His eyes flickered toward me, soft but grave, as though he carried the weight of my grandmother's love in his hands. I felt my knees weaken, my heart hammering against my ribs. Could it be? Could this be the secret my grandmother had whispered about in her final days? The promise that love, not greed, would guide her legacy? The church was silent now, every whisper swallowed. My family's judgmental glares faltered, replaced by unease. Claire shifted in her seat, her fingers clenching the fabric of her dress. And then, slowly, carefully, the pastor broke the seal. He unfolded the letter, the paper crackling in the silence of the church. His eyes scanned the first line, his lips parting. "To my granddaughter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing everyone in place. And with that, the room shifted, from accusation to revelation, from judgment to suspense, as the truth hidden for years prepared to come into the light. The letter wasn't just words on paper. It was my grandmother's voice speaking from the grave. When the pastor's voice carried those first trembling words, "To my granddaughter," it felt as though the walls of the church dissolved, and time folded back on itself. For a moment, I wasn't standing at the altar in white lace, surrounded by whispers and judgment. I was a little girl again, curled up in my grandmother's lap, listening to her read bedtime stories in that same steady rhythm. Her voice had been gone for months, and yet here it was, resurrected through ink and parchment. I gripped the bouquet tighter, petals bruising under my fingers, my chest rising and falling in uneven waves. Every muscle in my body ached to hear more, even as fear twisted in my stomach.
Venom brewing among them, the hunger that would not be satisfied by love alone. The pastor continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "I leave this truth not for everyone, but for Emma. She is the one who held my hand through the night when my strength failed. She is the one who understood that home is not about walls and doors, but about the love we keep alive within them. She is the one who never turned her back, even when others chose distance." Shock pulsed through me. My grandmother's words wrapped around me like a blanket, equal parts comfort and burden. To hear her name me directly in this letter, in front of everyone, felt like a light shone into the darkness, but it also painted a target on my back, confirming what my relatives had feared, that Grandma's heart, and perhaps her legacy, had been entrusted to me. A hiss of whispers filled the church again. I turned slightly and caught the sight of my aunt's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowed with fury. A cousin leaned toward another, muttering harshly. And Claire, my perfect, polished sister, sat stiff as stone, her face pale but her eyes burning with quiet rage. The pastor read on. "To those who doubt my words, remember this. Love cannot be forged. Loyalty cannot be faked. You may hold papers and signatures, but you cannot hold the truth in your fists. And to you, Emma, I say this. Do not let their anger silence you. Do not let their judgment strip you of the love we shared. When you feel lost, know that I left more than this letter. I left a safeguard, a truth they cannot twist. Trust the notary." My breath hitched at the last words. A notary? My mind spun, trying to connect the dots. Did she mean there was another will? Another document she had secured in secret? Suspense coiled in the pit of my stomach, sharp and heavy. The murmurs grew louder now, denial spreading like fire. "This is ridiculous," an uncle barked. "Anyone could have written that." "It's a trick," an aunt hissed, shaking her head. Claire finally rose to her feet, her voice cold and cutting. "How convenient," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Grandma leaves behind a letter no one ever saw until today? Convenient that it paints you as her favorite, isn't it?" To the present. In that moment, I knew. Whatever storms this letter unleashed, I wouldn't be facing them alone. The pastor silenced the room once more, his voice calm but unyielding. This letter is not opinion. It is the words of a woman who has passed, preserved in her own hand. You may argue about meaning, but you cannot erase her voice. He lowered his gaze to the paper again, reading the final lines. If they question you, Emma, do not fear. The truth waits, locked and sealed, beyond their reach. It rests with the notary I trusted. Seek, and you will find what cannot be denied. The church erupted in chaos, voices clashing, denials ringing out, accusations thrown like stones. I stood frozen, my ears ringing, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. My grandmother's words hung in the air, impossible to erase, undeniable even in the face of fury. And yet, all I could think about was that final clue, the notary, a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. As the pastor folded the letter and placed it carefully back in its envelope, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. The room around me blurred, but the words remained sharp. Somewhere out there, locked away with a notary, was the truth that could either destroy me or set me free. The moment her secrets were dragged into the light, the room turned into a battlefield. The pastor's voice still echoed through the church, the last words of my grandmother's letter hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to break. For one breathtaking second, the silence was absolute. You could hear nothing but the faint hum of electricity from the lights above and the pounding of my own heart in my chest. Then, all at once, the dam burst. The pews erupted in chaos. My aunts began talking over each other, their voices sharp and shrill. Cousins leaned across the aisles, arguing in half-whispers that were loud enough for everyone to hear. My uncle, the same one who had stood up earlier to humiliate me, now pointed a trembling finger at the pastor. "This is a trick," he barked. "Anyone could have forged that letter." Claire finally rose to her feet, her cream-colored dress flawless, whole. But something inside me, something deeper than fear, refused. Humiliation bled into anger, and anger began to harden into something steadier. Determination. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to look at Claire, to meet her icy gaze without flinching. She wanted me to wilt. They all did. But if my grandmother had trusted me enough to leave this letter, then I owed her more than silence. The pastor raised his hand, his voice firm despite the chaos. "Enough!" His words cut through the noise, though not everyone obeyed. Still, his tone carried authority, the kind you couldn't argue with easily. "This letter is authentic. I have had it for months, sealed and untouched, entrusted to me directly. I was instructed to read it only if questions about truth arose. Today, those questions have come." "Authentic?" Claire shot back, her voice dripping with venom. "How can we be sure? A letter no one knew about? Words spoken conveniently when Emma's being questioned? Forgive me if I don't take your word for it." My uncle nodded in agreement. "This is nothing more than a performance. It proves nothing." The injustice of it all seared through me. How easily they dismissed her words, as though my grandmother's voice, preserved through her own hand, meant nothing. How quickly they twisted her final wishes into an inconvenience to be brushed aside. I wanted to scream, to shout at them that they hadn't been there, hadn't cared, hadn't sat by her bed when she was too weak to even sip water. I had. And now they dared to act as though they had more right to her legacy than I did. I felt my groom's hand slide into mine again, his palm steady, his thumb brushing reassurance into my skin. He leaned in close, his voice quiet but fierce. "Don't let them take this from you," he whispered. "She chose you for a reason. Hold on to that." Relief flickered inside me, fragile but real. His presence was a lifeline in the storm, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Even if the church turned against me, even if my family spit venom into my face, I had someone who believed me, someone who believed in me. The pastor continued, his voice stronger now, more resolute.
And destroy, until the letter was nothing more than an argument buried under. If I wanted justice, if I wanted my grandmother's truth to stand, I needed something stronger. That's when her words echoed in my mind. Trust the notary. It hit me like a revelation. Somewhere out there, beyond their reach, a piece of undeniable proof still existed. A safeguard my grandmother had hidden, knowing exactly how her family would react. She had prepared for this moment, for their betrayal, for their greed. Suspense coiled in my chest, sharp and heavy. The letter was only the beginning. If I wanted to end this battle, I would have to step into a bigger war, one that would drag me beyond this church, beyond this wedding day, into secrets they had tried to bury. But even as that determination hardened inside me, a shadow fell across my resolve. As the chaos in the church began to subside, one of my relatives leaned close as they brushed past me. Their breath was hot against my ear, their words low and venomous. "If you go looking," they whispered, "they'll destroy you." And with that, my grandmother's gift transformed from comfort into danger, and I realized the truth wasn't just hidden. It was being guarded by people willing to do anything to keep it buried. The drive to the notary's office felt less like a trip and more like walking straight into enemy territory. When I should have been on my honeymoon, sipping champagne and laughing under a string of fairy lights, I was instead behind the wheel of my car, gripping it so tightly my knuckles burned white. The wedding was supposed to be the start of a new life, but instead it had become the doorway to a battle I had never asked for. My grandmother's letter had opened a box of secrets too large to close again, and now it was pulling me down a road that smelled less like celebration and more like war. The further I drove, the heavier the silence became. My groom had wanted to come with me, but I asked him not to. This part, the pursuit of the truth, felt like something I had to do alone. Love had given me strength, but truth demanded solitude. My stomach knotted with every mile marker I passed, because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Every black SUV in my rearview mirror made my chest tighten. Every turn of the road felt like a test of my resolve. The notary's office was a plant that had given up months ago. Behind the desk, an elderly man sat hunched over a file, his reading glasses sliding halfway down his nose. His hair was silver, his face mapped with lines not just of age, but of weariness, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a truth too heavy for too long. He looked up as I stepped inside, and the recognition in his eyes hit me like a wave. Not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition, as though he had been waiting for me, even if he wished I'd never come. His voice was quiet, weighted. "Emma," he said, "so it's finally you." For a moment, I froze. How could he know me by sight alone? But then it dawned on me. Of course he would. My grandmother had probably shown him photographs, told him about me in the same way she told me about her garden or her favorite hymns. He wasn't surprised because she had prepared him for this day, just as she had prepared me. I stepped closer, my throat dry. "You knew I would come." His mouth pressed into a line, and then he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. We need to talk." I obeyed, my heart pounding, and waited. He folded his hands over the desk, staring down at them before speaking. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from guilt. "Your grandmother trusted me. She brought me a will, handwritten, clear, and resolute. I notarized it myself. It was valid, binding, and without question her true intention." He paused, his voice breaking. "But that document, it's gone now." Shock slammed into me like a physical blow. My chest felt hollow, my breath stolen. Gone? How can it be gone? You notarized it. You sealed it. How? His eyes lifted to mine then, glassy with shame. I was forced into silence. The words chilled me. Forced. Not asked, not persuaded, forced. He explained how one day, without warning, men had come to his office. Not relatives, not anyone he knew personally. Men in suits, calm and polite, but with eyes that cut like blades. They told him the will would be removed from the records. They told him it never existed. And then they told him if he breathed a word of it, he wouldn't just lose his career. He could lose more.
He lowered his voice. Right. And yet her voice had been buried. My jaw tightened, my fingernails digging into my palms. They had tried to erase her, but they hadn't counted on me. The notary shifted, as if bracing himself. Then he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, worn box. He slid it toward me with both hands, his expression grave. I couldn't save the document, but I made something else. A duplicate of my seal. If you find a copy of the will, even a draft, even a photograph, this seal will prove I authenticated it. It matches the one I placed on her original. It's the only proof I can give you. My fingers shook as I lifted the box. Inside lay a small metal seal, tarnished but still gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. For a moment, relief flooded me. Sharp, almost painful. This was proof. This was power. This was hope that could not be silenced. But relief twisted into fear almost immediately. If these men had threatened him, if they had stolen documents and erased records, then they were far bigger, far darker than just my family's petty grudges. And if they had wanted her silence badly enough to frighten her notary, what would they do to me once they realized I had picked up the trail? The notary leaned closer, his voice low but urgent, his eyes locking onto mine. Emma, listen to me carefully. Your family, your sister, your uncles, your cousins, they aren't the real enemy here. They are pawns. Pawns in a game they don't even understand. The ones who forced me into silence, they're bigger than this house, bigger than this town. If you keep digging, you won't just be fighting your relatives. His words made the air feel colder, heavier. I swallowed hard, clutching the seal as though it could steady me against the weight of his warning. And then he said the words that carved themselves into my chest like a prophecy. Your family isn't the enemy. They're just pawns in a bigger game. And with that, the truth I thought I was chasing shattered into something far more dangerous, leaving me standing at the edge of a conspiracy larger than I had ever imagined. The truth was bigger than betrayal. It was a conspiracy that had been living in the shadows for years. When I left the notary's office with the duplicate seal in my bag, I thought I had taken the first real step. Time. If my relatives weren't the masterminds, then who was? Who had the power to silence a notary, erase documents, and push my sister to betray me? The answer came sooner than I expected, and it came from looking at the one person who had been silent from the beginning. The lawyer, Dalton. The man who had handled my grandmother's estate for decades. The man who had read out the forged will with eyes fixed firmly on his papers so he wouldn't have to meet mine. The memory of his voice made my skin crawl. Clipped, rehearsed, every word delivered with too much polish and not enough humanity. At the time, I thought it was formality. Now I recognized it for what it was. Guilt dressed in professional robes. I began digging through every scrap of information I had collected so far. The letters my grandmother left me. The photocopies of the will that Claire had flaunted. The drafts from the storage unit. Every piece had something in common. Discrepancies that no seasoned lawyer should have overlooked. Dates that didn't align. Language my grandmother would never have used. Witnesses who mysteriously could not be found. Betrayal had always burned hot, but this was colder, surgical. This was betrayal committed with precision, the kind that required planning and cooperation. I felt my chest tighten as I realized Dalton hadn't just let things slide. He had orchestrated them. He was the one who had smoothed the edges of the forgery until it looked real. He was the one who had silenced questions before they could be asked. He had turned my grandmother's death into an opportunity for profit. The injustice cut deeper than I thought I could bear. My grandmother had trusted him. For decades, she had walked into his office, signed her name in front of him, asked his advice. He had been in her home, sitting at her kitchen table. She believed in his integrity, and he used that trust as a weapon. But what made my blood run cold was what I discovered next. Through public records and financial filings, I traced the mansion's appraisal history. It had been inflated and deflated strategically over the past few years, almost as if preparing it for something bigger. I cross-checked the dates with transactions connected to shell companies. Companies with names so bland they could slip through unnoticed. Whitestone Holdings, Riverbend LLC, Crown Enterprises, and every trail, every financial loop led back to Dalton's firm. It wasn't just a forged will. They weren't villains, they were marionettes, and the hands pulling the strings belonged to men like Dalton, men who had built their lives on power and control.
Suspense gripped me as I started documenting everything. I photographed the letters, scanned the drafts of the will, organized receipts and statements into neat folders. I wrote out timelines, marking every inconsistency, every strange detail. I built a wall of evidence, piece by piece, until my apartment looked less like a home and more like a crime investigation unit. But no matter how much proof I gathered, fear crept in like a shadow. If Dalton had silenced a notary, if he had erased a legal will, what would he do to me if he knew how close I was getting? I thought about the threatening note slipped under my door, the footsteps I sometimes heard behind me at night, the way cars slowed when passing my street. My chest tightened with helplessness. I was one woman against an empire. And yet, beneath the fear, resolve began to harden. My grandmother had trusted me for this fight. She had planted breadcrumbs because she believed I would follow them. She had whispered her last words with a faith I couldn't let die. "Remember where love is hidden," she told me. And maybe love was hidden not in safety, but in courage. Still, there were moments when I collapsed under the weight of it all. Nights when I curled into myself on the couch, sobbing into pillows because it felt impossible. Days when the evidence looked like nothing more than scattered paper no one would ever believe. I questioned everything. My strength, my sanity, even my marriage. What kind of bride abandons her honeymoon to fight shadows? What kind of woman risks everything for a house? But then I'd see her handwriting again. The loops, the smudges, the hesitation marks where her hand had trembled but her resolve had not. And I would remember why I couldn't stop. This wasn't about walls or chandeliers. This was about her voice, the one they tried to erase. It was late one evening, the evidence board glowing in the dim light of my desk lamp, when I heard a knock at the door. My heart stuttered. I froze, the silence pressing in. Slowly, I approached, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. On the other side stood Mr. Whitcomb, the family friend who had lived next to Grandma for years. His imagined. And as I stood in the doorway, holding the envelope, I realized that the deeper I went, the fewer allies I truly had. I thought I had found an ally, but instead, I had handed my enemy the knife. After Mr. Whitcomb's warning, my nerves were frayed. Sleep came in short, shallow breaths, broken by the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I couldn't shake the image of him slipping that envelope into my hands, his voice whispering that even those beside me could not be trusted. The words repeated in my head like a curse, but in that sea of doubt, I clung to one person I believed I could rely on, Daniel, my cousin. Daniel had been the closest thing I had to a brother growing up. When Claire teased me, he defended me. When family arguments broke out, he slipped me jokes under the table to make me laugh. He was the one relative who seemed to see me for who I was, not who I wasn't. In a family where loyalty felt conditional, Daniel's presence had always been unconditional, or so I thought. I called him late one night, my voice cracking as I asked if I could meet him. I can't do this alone anymore, I admitted. He didn't hesitate. Of course, he said. Meet me at the cafe by the park. We'll figure this out together. Relief washed over me so suddenly it made me dizzy. I wasn't alone after all. Maybe Whitcomb was wrong. Maybe paranoia had been eating at me so much that I had started doubting shadows. Daniel wasn't a shadow. He was family. The next morning, I met him at the cafe, my evidence bag slung over my shoulder like a lifeline. He greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered from childhood, his eyes soft, his hug steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Over steaming cups of coffee, I poured everything out. The letter, the notary's confession, the forged documents, the names of shell companies tied to Dalton. His brow furrowed as he listened, his hand squeezing mine across the table. "Emma," he said softly, "this is bigger than I thought. But you're not crazy. You're onto something real." Tears filled my eyes at the validation. "I knew you'd understand," I whispered. For hours, we sat there while I showed him photographs, notes, timelines. He asked questions, smirked. Even cousins grinned behind their hands. My face burned, humiliation flooding every vein. I stared at Claire, shock rooting me to the floor.
How did she know? And then my gaze flicked to Daniel. He looked away too quickly, his jaw tightening, his hands busying themselves with his napkin. The world tilted as the truth hit me. I had given him everything. My notes, my fears, my trust, and he had handed it to Claire like a gift. The injustice stung sharper than anything I had endured so far. My enemies I could face, their hatred I expected, but betrayal from someone I loved, someone I believed in, that was a wound that cut straight to the bone. I excused myself, my voice breaking as I stumbled out of the house. The cold night air slapped my face, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound of their laughter still ringing in my ears. Humiliation swirled with rage until I could barely breathe. Daniel had been my last anchor, and he had let me drown. Back in my apartment, I tore through my notes, sick with the realization that every word I had told him was now in Claire's hands. Every clue, every thread, every fragile piece of truth was compromised. My grandmother's secrets weren't safe anymore. Nothing was. For hours, I sat on the floor, surrounded by papers, my body shaking with grief. I thought of my grandmother's letter again, her words urging me to trust myself when others doubted. She had prepared me for betrayal, but I had ignored her warning. I had handed my enemy the knife myself. Suspense gnawed at me as I tried to decide what to do next. Should I burn it all and protect myself? Or keep fighting, knowing that each step made me more vulnerable? The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, every shadow whispering that I was being watched. That night, I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, my evidence piled beside me like a shield. But sleep didn't last long. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of paper sliding across the floor. My eyes shot open, my heart pounding. There, just inside the doorway, lay a folded note. The door was still locked, the windows shut, yet the note was there, lying like a snake on the carpet. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. 4 words stared. Distance. Every instinct told me I was walking into danger, but something stronger pulled me forward. The echo of my grandmother's voice, her letter's final plea. Trust the notary. The seal had given me courage, but what I needed now was proof. And if proof existed, it had to be in the place she cherished most, the mansion. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my shoes crunching softly on the gravel road. My palms were damp, my heartbeat a frantic rhythm in my ears. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette massive against the sky. Once it had been a sanctuary, its windows glowing with warmth, its halls filled with laughter and the clinking of china. Now it looked more like a sentinel, its shutters dark, its walls whispering secrets into the night. I slipped around the side, finding the old servants' entrance near the kitchen. The wood was weathered, the lock rusted, and it gave way with less resistance than I expected. The moment I stepped inside, the air wrapped around me like a shroud, thick with dust, heavy with memory. Every step I took echoed too loudly, the creak of floorboards sounding like accusations. My flashlight beam sliced through the dark, illuminating corners of rooms I had once run through as a child. The wallpaper was peeling, but beneath the decay, I could almost hear my grandmother's laughter, see her hands smoothing out a tablecloth, smell the cinnamon cookies she used to bake. But nostalgia wasn't what I had come for. I headed straight for the library. The library had always been her favorite room, lined with shelves that touched the ceiling, filled with books that carried not just stories, but secrets. I remembered how she used to tell me, "The walls here keep their own counsel. One day, they'll tell you what you need to know." At the time, I thought it was just one of her whimsical sayings. Now it felt like a prophecy. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, pushing them gently, listening for the hollow thud of hidden panels. At first, there was nothing. Panic clawed at me, warning me, guiding me. I clutched the letters to my chest, whispering a silent thank you into the dust-filled air. Then I saw it. An envelope tucked behind a framed photograph of her wedding day. Its edges were yellowed, but the words written across it in bold letters made my heart stop. Second will. My hands shook as I pulled it free, my breath shallow. This was it. This was the proof. I could already imagine walking into court, slamming it down on the desk, watching Claire's smug smile shatter. My grandmother's truth, preserved. But when I tore the envelope open, my stomach dropped. It was empty. The paper inside had been ripped out, the envelope nothing more than a hollow shell of what once was. I stared into its emptiness as despair washed over me. Someone had found it first. Someone had stolen the very thing I had risked everything to find. Shock turned into devastation, my knees buckling as I sank to the floor, clutching the empty envelope like it was a corpse. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My grandmother's safeguard, her promise, had slipped through my fingers. All I had left were scraps, whispers, and shadows. Humiliation burned hot in my chest. How could I have been so foolish to think I could outpace them? Whoever had orchestrated this conspiracy had been 2 steps ahead from the start. They had infiltrated the notary, manipulated my family, and now they had stripped the walls of the mansion too. Still, even through the despair, a sliver of resolve sparked. The envelope itself was proof. Its existence confirmed my grandmother's intention, even if the will inside was gone. And if someone had taken it, then someone had left a trail. I rose shakily to my feet, clutching the envelope and letters, and turned toward the door. That's when I heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard in the hallway. My blood turned cold. I froze, every muscle taut, my flashlight beam trembling as I raised it toward the sound. Another creak followed, closer this time. Someone else was here. The realization sent a chill straight through my spine. I wasn't the only one searching for secrets tonight. And as the echo of footsteps moved closer through the darkness, I realized I wasn't just
Let go of the past, who was inventing lies to justify her jealousy. To make matters worse, Dalton, the family lawyer I now knew was entangled in this conspiracy, represented her. His polished voice carried a kind of poisonous authority, each word delivered with the weight of his reputation. When the judge asked Claire to speak, she rose with flawless poise. Her cream-colored suit was immaculate, her hair perfectly pinned. Her voice trembled just enough to sound human, but not enough to betray calculation. "Your Honor," she began, "I've tried to be patient. I've tried to understand my sister's grief, but her behavior has become dangerous, not just for me, but for everyone involved." Every sentence she spoke was a dagger hidden in silk. She described how I had harassed her with accusations, how I had trespassed into the mansion, how I had stolen letters that belonged to the family. She painted me not as a woman seeking truth, but as a broken bride clinging to fantasies. Each word left me more hollow, as if she was peeling away my dignity piece by piece. Dalton leaned in at just the right moments, guiding her testimony, reinforcing her story with the authority of legal jargon. He spoke of mental instability, of fabricated evidence, of delusions born of grief. He used my love for my grandmother as a weapon against me, twisting my loyalty into obsession. The courtroom nodded along, their eyes heavy with pity or skepticism. Humiliation scorched my skin. I could feel myself shrinking under their gaze, my hands trembling in my lap. Every instinct told me to run, to escape the suffocating walls of that courtroom. But running would mean surrender. Surrender not just of the house, but of my grandmother's voice. When the judge turned to me, I rose on legs that felt like paper. My voice cracked as I tried to defend myself. I spoke of my grandmother's letter, of the notary's confession, of the seal I carried as proof. But without the second will, without undeniable documents, my words felt like smoke drifting into nothingness. Dalton's smirk widened with each shaky sentence I spoke,
as if he knew he was watching me crumble. By the time I sat down, crouching beside me, without a word, he slipped an old envelope into my hands. I stared at it, stunned. "What is this?" I whispered. His voice was low, cautious. "I found it in the archives while cleaning. Buried where it shouldn't have been. I thought you might need it." His gaze lingered on me for a heartbeat longer. Then he straightened and walked away as if nothing had happened. My hands shook as I turned the envelope over. Its edges were frayed, its seal brittle with age. Fear and hope tangled in my chest, each breath a battle. I tore it open with trembling fingers, the courtroom noises fading into nothing. Inside was something I never expected. Not a letter, not a draft of a will, but a cassette tape. For a long moment I just stared at it, the small black rectangle heavy with possibility. My grandmother had never owned a computer, had never trusted technology. But I remembered the tape recorder she kept on her bedside table, the one she used to dictate thoughts when her hands grew too weak to write. Suspense wrapped around me like a vice. What was on this tape? Could it be her voice, her final attempt to preserve the truth they had tried to erase? Or was it something more dangerous, something that could shatter me even further? As I held that cassette in my trembling hands, I realized the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, my grandmother's voice might be waiting to speak again. This time, in a courtroom where no one could ignore it. The moment her voice filled the courtroom, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The cassette tape felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just plastic and ribbon, but the weight of everything I had lost. My hands shook as I held it up for the judge to see, my voice barely steady as I explained how it had come into my possession. Dalton sneered, his lips curling into that smug expression that made my skin crawl. And Claire sat stiff in her seat, her knuckles whitening as she clutched the edge of the table. The judge leaned back, eyebrows arched, his gavel tapping lightly against the wood. "A cassette tape," he said, his tone more curious than mocking. "You believe this is relevant to the matter at hand?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor. This tape was recorded by my grandmother before her death. It contains her words." Place. The wheels clicking before the faint hiss of static filled the courtroom. For a breathless moment, the world stood still. And then, her voice. My grandmother's voice, soft yet strong, trembling yet resolute, filled the courtroom. "This is Margaret Whitfield, and I am recording this so that my words cannot be twisted after I am gone. To my granddaughter Emma, if you are hearing this, then you are already facing the storm I feared. Do not doubt yourself. You are the one I chose to carry the truth." The air was sucked out of the room. My knees went weak, and I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. Tears blurred my vision, rolling down my cheeks before I could stop them. It was like she was alive again, speaking not just to the court but to me. Her voice reaching across the divide of death to remind me that I was not alone. "I wrote a second will," she continued, "because I feared the first would be taken, altered, or destroyed. I placed my faith in a notary I trusted, sealing it with my own hand. If anyone tells you otherwise, they are lying. The house, the land, the memories within those walls, they belong with Emma, because she understands what they mean." Shock rippled across the room. Gasps echoed from the benches, murmurs rising like waves. Claire's face drained of color, her lips parting as if she might faint. Dalton's composure cracked, his jaw tightening as he shuffled his papers too quickly, his fingers trembling. For me, it was an emotional collapse. Grief, relief, and vindication colliding all at once. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to contain the ache that surged there. For months I had been ridiculed, dismissed, humiliated. And now, here she was. Her voice undeniable, her love undeniable, her truth undeniable. But just as quickly as hope filled the room, denial pushed back. Claire stood, her voice sharp, desperate. "This is fake," she shouted. "Anyone could have imitated her voice. Technology can do that. This is nothing but a cheap trick." Dalton nodded furiously, seizing her argument. "Exactly. Without authentication, this is a parlor stunt. It cannot be trusted, and it should not sway this court. We cannot validate audio without
Breathe. The judge finally spoke. We will recess until this matter is further investigated. Miss Whitfield, he said, turning to me, you have one more chance. If what this tape says is true, find the sealed document. Otherwise, we cannot accept it. I nodded, my tears drying into determination. This was the path my grandmother had carved for me, and I would follow it, no matter where it led. As the court emptied, I gathered my papers with trembling hands, my body still quaking from the sound of her voice. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of strength, a light breaking through the shadows. But just as I turned to leave, Claire brushed past me, her perfume sharp, her nails digging briefly into my arm. She leaned close, her whisper venomous, her breath hot against my ear. "If you find it," she hissed, "you'll regret it." And in that moment, I realized the battle had only just begun, and my sister was willing to destroy me before she let the truth destroy her. His hands shook as he confessed, because the truth had been buried under threats for years. The cassette tape had cracked the courtroom wide open, but it also left me with a single directive: find the sealed copy with the notary. That night, I couldn't sleep. My grandmother's voice still echoed in my ears, a haunting mixture of comfort and urgency. Every syllable replayed like a hymn. She had known this day would come. She had left behind breadcrumbs, and I was now chasing them into places darker than I had ever dared to step. I tracked the name through old directories, digging through records until I found him. Gerald Fletcher. Once a respected notary with an office on Main Street, he had retired abruptly 5 years ago. No public explanation, no farewell announcement. He had simply vanished from professional life. People whispered about his health, about family troubles, but no one had asked too many questions. That was exactly what men like Dalton counted on. I drove out to the address I found listed under his name, a weathered house at the end of a quiet lane outside town. The grass was overgrown, the shutters peeling, but smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Someone was home. When Gerald opened the door, I barely recognized him but none of them looked touched in weeks. He gestured for me to sit. I lowered myself into the chair, my heart pounding. "I know why you're here," he said finally, "and I wish I could tell you it would be simple, but it isn't." I leaned forward. "The tape mentioned you. Grandma said you held a sealed copy of her will. Please, if it's real, if it still exists, I need it. It's the only way to prove the truth." His hands shook as he pressed them together, his knuckles pale. His eyes watered, not from weakness, but from shame. "I had it once. I signed it, sealed it, notarized it with my own hand. It was binding, beyond dispute. But then they came." The room seemed to shrink around me. They? His gaze darted toward the window, as though expecting shadows to press against the glass. 2 men in suits, calm, polite, but with eyes that made it clear there would be consequences if I didn't cooperate. They told me the will was inconvenient, that it would interfere with certain plans. They said if I valued my career, my life, I would keep silent. His voice cracked, heavy with a guilt that had clearly haunted him for years. So I did. Shock thundered through me. It wasn't just negligence. It wasn't just my family's greed. It was suppression, orchestrated by people powerful enough to erase legality with a single threat. "But," he continued, his voice trembling, "I couldn't live with myself completely. I couldn't save the will, but I saved something." He stood slowly, his knees stiff, and shuffled toward an old cabinet in the corner. My breath caught as he opened the drawer, reaching deep into the shadows before pulling out a small velvet pouch. His hands shook violently as he placed it on the table in front of me. Inside lay a duplicate seal, identical to the one he had pressed onto the original will. "This," he said, his voice low but steady, "matches the one I used on her document. If you ever find a draft, a copy, anything that bears her words, this seal will confirm its authenticity." It's all I could save. Relief surged through me, sharp and almost painful. My fingers closed around the pouch, my heart pounding with hope. This wasn't the full will, but it was proof.
a weapon I could wield against the lies. But before I could thank him, Gerald's expression darkened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice.
The end of the line. She was a distraction, a mask behind which something far more dangerous operated. I sat back, clutching the pouch with the seal, my pulse racing. Humiliation burned in me as I realized how naive I had been, thinking this was a simple battle of wills between sisters. No, this was deeper, darker, rooted in secrets I had only begun to glimpse. Gerald's hand trembled as he covered mine briefly. His touch was fragile, but his eyes were urgent. Emma, listen to me. The one you should fear most hasn't even shown their face yet. And with those words, I knew my grandmother's battle wasn't just mine to finish. It was a war against enemies I hadn't even met yet. Secrets rot in the dark, but that night I dragged them into the light. After Gerald's confession, after the weight of his trembling words, the one you should fear most hasn't even shown their face yet. I knew silence was no longer an option. For months, I had been cornered, ridiculed, and threatened in private. But lies thrived in shadows, and I was done hiding in them. If the truth was ever going to survive, I had to make it public. That's why I called for a gathering at the mansion. It was bold, almost reckless, but I didn't care. I contacted the local press, the pastor who had been with me from the beginning, and neighbors who had seen Claire's arrogance firsthand. I even sent invitations to every relative, though most of them had mocked me or stayed silent. If they wanted a show, I was going to give them one, but this time, I would be the one holding the stage. The night of the event, the mansion glowed like it hadn't in years. Strings of lights wrapped around the porch railings, cameras from the press clicked as reporters set up, and cars lined the long gravel driveway. Inside, the library had been transformed into a gathering hall. Chairs faced the grand fireplace, and on the mantel above it lay the evidence I had collected: my grandmother's letters, the duplicate notary seal, and the cassette tape. As people filtered in, I felt a storm of emotions crash within me. Fear, yes, but also resolve. My grandmother's words, her warnings, her love, had carried me here, and I was going to make sure everyone heard her voice, even if it meant
Barry the pastor nodded at me from his seat, his presence like a shield. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. My relatives exchanged wary glances, some skeptical, others uneasy. I began with my grandmother's letters, reading passages aloud. Her warnings about greed, her distrust of Claire, her insistence on fairness. I held up her handwriting, letting the cameras capture it, letting the weight of her words fall into the silence. Then, I revealed Gerald's duplicate seal. The small metal object glinted under the light, its insignia matching the marks in her journals. Gasps rippled through the room. This, I said firmly, was the seal used on her true will, the one that was stolen, the one Dalton and Claire never wanted you to see. Claire shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering. Finally, I played the cassette. My grandmother's voice filled the room again, trembling but steady, resolute in her choice. Reporters leaned forward, relatives stiffened, and even neighbors who had come out of curiosity looked shaken. Every word was a nail in the coffin of their lives. When the tape ended, silence blanketed the room. I looked at Claire, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. "You said I was delusional," I told her. "You mocked me. You laughed as our family whispered behind my back. But this," I gestured to the letters, the seal, the tape. "This is truth, and you can't hide from it anymore." For the first time, her composure cracked. She shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "This doesn't prove anything. It's all circumstantial. You're twisting everything." But her words faltered as the pastor stood, his voice calm but firm. "Claire, I was there when your grandmother entrusted me with part of her story. I saw the fear in her eyes. I believe Emma, and so should everyone here." The room shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Relatives muttered among themselves, doubt spreading like wildfire. The pressure on Claire mounted with every second, and she knew it. Her cheeks flushed,
her breaths shallow, her mask slipping away piece by piece. Finally, she snapped. Her eyes darted wildly, her voice rising into a near scream. "Fine, you want—"
Then Claire's voice pierced the storm once more, shrill, desperate, final. "I wasn't the only one. Ask the lawyer!" And in that moment, I realized the battle wasn't ending. It was widening. The mansion was just the beginning, and the man who had hidden behind polished words and legal documents was about to be dragged into the light. What I thought was a family feud turned out to be a conspiracy much larger than blood. After Claire's public breakdown, the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place faster than I could process them. For months, I had thought this was about jealousy, inheritance, and old grudges. But now the curtain was pulled back, and what stood behind it was far darker, a network of greed and corruption that had used my family as pawns. The evidence began trickling in almost immediately. Reporters dug into Dalton's financial records. Investigators subpoenaed documents from his firm. What emerged was a paper trail so intricate it looked like a spider's web, but one spun from greed, not silk. Dalton hadn't just helped Claire forge a will. He had orchestrated it from the beginning, drafting the fraudulent document, pushing Claire to sign, and then suppressing every piece of evidence that contradicted it. Why? Because the mansion wasn't just a house, it was a prize. The estate sat on land with deep historical value and an appraisal worth millions. Through carefully arranged sales and transfers, Dalton and his associates had planned to funnel the property into shell companies. Once sold, it would become a front for laundering dirty money. Real estate had always been the perfect disguise. Brick and mortar to hide blood and shadows. The betrayal slammed into me harder than any of Claire's insults. My grandmother's home, the place where I'd learned to ride a bike, where she taught me how to bake cookies, where every wall carried her laughter, had been reduced to a ledger entry. To Dalton, it was never about heritage or family or honor. It was about numbers, about greed so cold it could turn love into currency. Claire, I learned, had been manipulated. Dalton had promised her wealth, influence, and a place at his side. He had dangled the mansion as bait, convincing her it was hers by right, all while knowing she was nothing more than his
seal, the cassette tape, and now the financial records. They formed a chain so strong, even Dalton's polished lies couldn't break it. But men like Dalton didn't climb to power by standing still. They survived by running, by vanishing into the shadows just as the light touched them. The morning of the trial, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the steps, cameras ready to capture Dalton's downfall. Inside, I sat with my attorney, clutching the velvet pouch with the notary's seal as if it were a talisman. The judge entered, the room rose, and the bailiff called Dalton's name. Silence followed. He wasn't there. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge frowned. The bailiff repeated his call, but the doorway remained empty. Finally, the announcement came. Dalton had fled. He had abandoned Claire, abandoned the case, abandoned everything. Humiliation crashed over Claire like a tidal wave. She stood alone at her table, her hands shaking, her face drained of color. For the first time, she looked less like the smug sister who had ridiculed me, and more like a trapped child who realized her puppeteer had cut the strings. But for me, the betrayal deepened into something sharper. Dalton's flight meant there were more shadows to chase, more secrets hidden beyond my reach. He hadn't fled out of fear of me or even the court. He had fled because someone bigger, someone more dangerous, had pulled him out of the game. The judge's gavel cracked, calling the room to order. "Until Dalton Fletcher is found," he said sternly, "this trial will proceed without him. Ms. Claire Whitfield will stand accountable." I exhaled, my pulse racing, knowing this was only partial victory. Claire was exposed, yes, but the mastermind had slipped through the cracks. And as I watched her crumble under the weight of her isolation, I realized the mansion was no longer just a battlefield. It was bait.
and the war behind it was far from over. When the gavel fell, it wasn't just a ruling. It was justice echoing from my grandmother's grave. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every shuffle of paper, every creak of a chair, every cough echoed louder than it should have. Weeks of testimony, months of humiliation, and years of stood alone. And now she would face what justice looked like. The judge shuffled the final documents, his voice steady as he read. After reviewing the authenticated seal, the recorded testimony, the cassette evidence, and corroborating letters, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Emma Whitfield. My heart stopped. The true will of Margaret Whitfield is hereby recognized. The estate and mansion are returned to their rightful heir, Emma Whitfield. Furthermore, Claire Whitfield will face charges of fraud and perjury. A warrant remains active for Dalton Fletcher, whose absence will not shield him from justice. The gavel cracked against the wood, final and decisive. Relief flooded me in a wave so powerful it nearly knocked me off the bench. My shoulders sagged, my breath hitched, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could inhale without choking. Tears welled up and spilled over, not from weakness, but from release. I hadn't just won back a house. I had restored my grandmother's voice. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I swear I could hear her laughter again, floating through the courtroom, soft and steady, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Claire broke down completely. She sobbed, shaking her head, muttering that it wasn't fair, that she had been promised things she never received. She tried to blame Dalton, tried to claw her way out of the corner she had backed herself into, but it was useless. The cameras captured everything: the trembling hands, the broken facade, the humiliation she could no longer mask. Justice was not only restored, it was witnessed. The reporters swarmed me as I exited the courthouse. Flashes blinded me, microphones thrust forward with rapid-fire questions. Emma, how does it feel to win? What will you do with the mansion now? Do you have anything to say to your sister? I could barely form words, my emotions too tangled. But finally, I looked at the cameras and said softly, "This was never about property. This was about truth." And today, my grandmother's truth was heard. Neighbors embraced me when I returned home. Strangers sent letters of support. For once, the whispers weren't cruel. They were kind. They spoke of resilience, of courage, of how I had stood when no one else believed me. Near, but not complete. The mansion had always carried secrets, and part of me knew there was still something left to uncover. That suspicion proved true when I entered my grandmother's study. The room smelled of leather and ink, exactly as it had the last time I sat there with her. I walked to the desk where she used to write letters, running my hand along its polished surface. And then I saw it. A drawer, slightly ajar, as though someone had opened it once and forgotten to close it properly. Curiosity prickled at me. I tugged it open, expecting nothing more than old receipts or dried pens. But there, nestled in the corner, was a small envelope sealed with wax. My breath caught. The seal was unmistakable. My grandmother's crest pressed deep into the wax, untouched, unbroken. Tears stung my eyes as I reached for it, my hand trembling. Another secret, another letter, another piece of her voice waiting to be heard. And as I held the sealed envelope under the study's dim light, I realized the fight wasn't over. One last message still waited to be revealed, and whatever was inside had the power to change everything again. Her final secret wasn't about property. It was about the kind of woman she wanted me to become. The envelope trembled in my hands as I broke the wax seal. The weight of everything I had endured, the humiliation in the courtroom, the threats under my door, the betrayal of family, the flight of the lawyer, pressed down on me. Yet nothing felt heavier than this single moment, sitting in my grandmother's study, about to open the last words she had left behind. Inside was a letter, folded carefully, her handwriting still strong despite the faint shakiness. My chest tightened as I read the opening lines, her voice once again leaping from the paper into the room. Emma, if you are reading this, then the fight is over. You have endured betrayal, injustice, and fear, but you have carried yourself with the strength I always knew you had.
I never intended for you to carry this burden just to win back a house. The house was never the gift. The real gift was what it could become if placed in the right hands. Yours. Tears blurred the words as I read on. She didn't speak of property or ownership. She spoke of legacy, of what love could build when it wasn't hoarded but shared. This mansion is more than walls. It is a story, transforming it into something greater. The following months became a whirlwind of decisions and rebuilding. The mansion's halls, once echoing with conflict, were filled with builders and volunteers. Neighbors who had watched my struggle now offered their hands to help. Reporters who once doubted me came back to cover the transformation. The house was no longer just mine. It was becoming something alive, something bigger. I converted the East Wing into classrooms for underprivileged children. The dining hall, once reserved for holiday feasts, became a community kitchen where no one would go hungry. The garden my grandmother once tended with her bare hands was revived into a public space where neighbors could gather, plant, and heal. Each brick I restored, each wall I painted, each corner I repurposed felt like a stitch mending wounds. Not just mine, not just my grandmother's, but the community's. The mansion no longer stood as a monument to greed and betrayal. It became a beacon of resilience and generosity. Of course, there were days when the betrayal still haunted me. Claire faced her charges and Dalton remained a fugitive, his shadow still looming somewhere beyond reach. The humiliation, the laughter, the cold stares in the courtroom, those memories did not vanish overnight, but they no longer defined me. What defined me was standing at the entrance of the mansion months later, as children's laughter filled the halls, as families shared meals in the dining room, as neighbors spoke of hope where once they whispered about scandal. My grandmother's voice was there in every sound, her dream realized not through possession, but through transformation. Justice had been restored, yes, but more importantly, love had been reborn. On the anniversary of her passing, I stood in the study once more, the final letter in my hand, and whispered to her memory, "I kept your truth. But more than that, I carried your legacy forward." And as the sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the room in golden light, I felt her presence, not as a ghost haunting the walls, but as love rooted in every beam, every brick, every breath of the mansion she entrusted to me. Her last words echoed in me, a question not just for me, but for anyone who carried secrets too heavy to bury forever. If truth can be buried, but never killed, what would your family's secrets reveal? If this